This is the starting video of the 100 Serial Killer Project. The first 9 serial killers have at least 5 confirmed murders. Let's take a look. Colin Ireland, aka the Gay Slayer. Sexuality is something I want to get out of the way early, and it seems my first subject gives me the opportunity. Victims of serial killers are very roughly 50-50 in terms of gender. That would suggest, relative to the general population and giving a prevalent sexual motive, a disproportionate amount of serial killers must be gay. But I don't think so. Some certainly are gay, but some of these so-called homosexual acts are about power, sadism, control, pain and humiliation, and not an expression of sexuality. I know that not all of the serial killers that target men are gay, but in this instance I don't know if Colin Ireland was gay. He murdered 5 gay men in 1993. Was there a denial and displaced aggression from the self in his killing? This is something we'll explore many more times going forward. Ireland allegedly claimed it was just because gay men are easy targets, and other times he claimed to be bisexual. Ireland mocked his victims, placing 2 teddy bears in a 69 position near one body, and staged other bodies in various positions to show his contempt. One victim had his pet cat killed, and Ireland put the cat's mouth over the victim's penis. We see evidence Ireland cared what the media had to say about him, even going so far as to report his own murder to the press. He wanted attention and notoriety for his crimes and practically taunted the police. His 5th and final kill ended by setting the flat on fire, and in his childhood there was evidence of arson as well. There are other classic indicators such as an absent father, juvenile delinquency, and an unstable and impoverished home life. Some of the UK tabloids called Ireland Jack the Gripper, or even the Fairy Liquidator. Herein lies part of the reason gay men are a common and easy target for predatory murderers. I prefer calling Ireland the Gay Slayer for its double meaning and the fact it isn't so flippant. There are a lot of themes I want to explore here. Dare I call them tropes of true crime serial killers? One concept I'd like to explore in more detail is the idea of homicidal protest, which might be pertinent in this case. But let's see what comparative killers I can cross-reference. As for Ireland, he died in Wakefield Prison aged 57 in 2012.
Who is that side of my character that is negative?
Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, aka the Toolbox Killers. I was hoping we'd get deeper into the project before we encounter a serial killer or killer duo I have a real problem with. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris killed 5 women in California in 1979. Before the women were killed, most were raped and tortured using items found in a common toolbox, hence the name. FBI profiler John Douglas said Bittaker was one of the worst, and coming from someone as seasoned as him, that's particularly chilling. Douglas remarked on how normal Bittaker seemed, and this is a detail we'll come back to again and again. Fact of the matter is even FBI agents and trained mental health professionals can't tell when someone is a psychopath, at least not a Factor 1 psychopath, without catching them in the act or without extensive questioning. What isn't so typical is Bittaker's IQ at 138. A score of 85 to 115 is around average, 115 to 130 is above average, and 130 to 145 is high IQ territory. Bittaker is one of the smartest killers on the list, as well as one of the cruelest. Bittaker was adopted as an infant, moved around a lot, and had a string of petty juvenile crimes. After a stint in prison, even his adopted parents abandoned him. He met Roy Norris in a different prison several years later, and they would start to plan their future. With most serial killer duos, one is usually the dominant and the other is the secondary, and I'd say Bittaker was the more dominant of the two, but Norris was far from submissive. Unwanted as a child by a negligent father and drug-addled mother, his own upbringing was also turbulent. After school, Norris enlisted with the Navy and served in Vietnam, but he didn't see combat. A few years after an honourable discharge, he was arrested for rape, and upon getting out of prison, he raped again. Upon another arrest, he went to the California men's colony and met and befriended Bittaker. When they both got out, they bought a van they nicknamed the Murder Mac and began their more terrible crimes. They picked up hitchhikers, but didn't assault them so as to practice their technique. When they did start killing, most of the victims were abducted, raped by both of them, and murdered. One pair of girls was held captive for 2 days. Allegedly there were other rapes, but those victims were allowed to live. In 1979 they abducted 16-year-old Shirley Lynette Ledford. The treatment she received was truly horrific, and Ledford allegedly begged for death. The pair were escalating at an alarming rate. There may well have been more victims. Luckily, the killer's undoing came quickly. Norris confided his and Bittaker's exploits to another former inmate at the California men's colony named Joseph Jackson. I don't know what crimes Jackson committed to be incarcerated, but clearly these grim tales were far beyond him, and he reported them. Police detained Bittaker and Norris, and at Bittaker's motel, the authorities found items belonging to the victims, toolbox murder weapons, several Polaroid shots of the missing girls, acid that was thankfully never used, and a tape. Bittaker and Norris had taped their torture session of Shirley Ledford, and the tape has become infamous. Bittaker enjoyed listening to it, and it was later played for the courtroom at their hearing, with many in attendance fleeing the room and/or crying at its contents. Bittaker was ultimately sentenced to death, but died in 2019, aged 79. Norris received life via a plea deal and died in 2020 at the age of 72. Stephen Kay, the prosecutor at Bittaker's trial, was traumatised and had nightmares for years afterwards. Paul Bynum, the chief investigator, committed suicide in December 1987. In a 10-page suicide note, he spoke of the toolbox killers haunting him. That tape is surely cursed. John Douglas played it for actor Scott Glenn, who was portraying Jack Crawford in the film Silence of the Lambs. Glenn reconsidered his position on the death penalty after that. Another particularly bizarre connection is that Gary Heidnik was an inspiration for one of the villains in Silence of the Lambs, besides Ed Gein, and Heidnik is another of John Douglas's most hated. Heidnik killed 2 women and had several others imprisoned in a dungeon that surely inspired the one we saw in the film. But there are more strange connections here. Heidnik is another rare high IQ killer. In fact, with an IQ of 148, 10 points higher than Bittaker, he could be considered a genius. Heidnik also had a bizarre connection to Norris in that they were both diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder. Both of them were diagnosed before their crime sprees, and both by military psychologists. Heidnik was a member of the US Army in the 60s, as opposed to Norris, who was a member of the Navy in the 70s. Schizoid personality disorder is a cluster A personality disorder characterized by extreme solitude, a lack of positive or negative emotions, and interestingly an aversion to sex, something both Heidnik and Norris were rather obsessed with. After conviction, Norris was described as an extreme sociopath. The toolbox killer's reign was cut mercifully short. Were it not for Joseph Jackson, Bittaker and Norris would have tortured and killed many more. Jackson was practically given an opportunity to join them but refused, and did the right thing by reporting them. Despite such a small deed, I've no problem calling Jackson a hero for ultimately stopping these two, who are commonly considered amongst the worst, becoming more prolific. The torture was so severe that, skipping ahead, I see few like them, and so I declare them both cruel and unusual.
Mr. Norris and another party took turns raping her.
Monty Rizzle. Rissel raped and killed 5 women in 1976 and 1977 in his state of Virginia, and raped a further 7 women throughout his life, committing his first rape at 14. Again, his home life seemed turbulent, and we have an absent father figure in his history. His mother remarried, but things were less than ideal. His murders strike me as extremely unorganised and spontaneous, with 2 involving drowning the victim and the remaining 3 being stabbed. Rissel might well be the youngest killer on this list. When he was sentenced, he was 18 years old. Consequently, there really isn't much of his life to explore and analyse, and he's still alive in prison today, aged 63. This individual strikes me as a Factor 2 psychopath. Impulsive, reckless, emotionally dysregulated to the point of homicidal anger. He wrote extensively about his crimes in prison, but I've not read his account, and I don't feel I can get much more from reading it. Let's just be thankful Rizzle never refined his craft. While researching this, I found a piece written by a certain newspaper that incorrectly claimed Rizzle had a genius-level IQ, and the page used a photo of Herbert Mullin, and couldn't count to 5. This highlights the importance of good research and how I might often fall short. Rizzle did have an IQ of 120, which is above average, but far from genius.
And I stabbed her in the back.
Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, aka the Moors murderers. When I was a kid, I remember seeing the face of Myra Hindley on the front of a tabloid. A cold mugshot of someone who I knew had done something dreadful, but I was too young to understand. What I did understand was she was one of the most hated women of the 20th century in the United Kingdom. Along with her boyfriend Ian Brady, they were ultimately convicted for 5 murders in and around Manchester in the mid-60s, and burying the bodies in the moors. Victims were between the age of 10 and 17, and 4 of them were raped. Brady was born to a young waitress and had no contact with his father. He went into foster care with his mother still visiting him, although he was supposedly quite bright. Behavioural problems and delinquency marred his early days. He later developed an interest in the Third Reich, and then got a job at Millwards, a chemical distribution company. Hindley's start was also troublesome. She was beaten as a child by an alcoholic father. This father encouraged her to be tough, even going so far as to tell her to beat up a boy who had hurt her. She complied. As a teenager, she lost a friend to drowning, and she was briefly engaged at 17 but called it off. At 18, she joined Millwards, where she met Brady. The two studied together, shunned their friends, joined various gun clubs. They were inseparable. Supposedly she dyed her hair blonde to imitate Germanic Aryan perfection. They had a morbid fascination and were inspired by the Leopold and Loeb case, where 2 little rich boys planned the perfect murder and failed. A few years later, Brady and Hindley would commit their own murders. Myra Hindley often lured the victims, who would be more trusting of a woman, into her car, and Brady would later kill them. There was often a ruse to find something on the moors, usually a lost glove, and often after raping the victims. The killers were careful and got away with 3 murders. It was around this time that Hindley's younger sister, Maureen Hindley, married a man called David Smith in 1964. Smith was no stranger to trouble himself, having a record for assault and burglary from as young as 11. He supposedly admired Brady. I suppose it's fair to say the 4 of them were friends, but Brady was escalating his crimes. The 4th victim, 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey, was abducted at a fun fair on the 26th of December 1964 and taken back to their lair at Wardlebrook Avenue. Downey was undressed, photographed, raped and strangled. She was buried in a shallow grave at Sandalworth Moor. The 5th victim, 17-year-old Edward Evans, was also killed at their house, but Myra's brother-in-law David Smith was there to witness it. That night he saw Brady killing Evans with a hatchet blow to the head, and strangulation via an electrical cord. They carried the body to the van the killer couple used. David Smith would later call the police. Smith's story reminds me of Joseph Jackson from the Toolbox Killers case, two men who had a criminal past but who drew the line at murder. I hadn't expected to find such a stark comparison so soon, and I think this is something that doesn't get talked about enough in true crime circles. But there's something else with a chilling echo. The fourth victim, 10-year-old Leslie Downey, wasn't just photographed, she was recorded on a tape. At the trial, that 16-minute tape was played to the court. The death penalty had been abolished in this country a year prior, which I imagine was of considerable irritation to some. Both Brady and Hindley were found guilty of 3 of the murders, with the full truth only coming out in 1985 and the following few years. Their murder count stands at 5, but there is a possibility of more. There are chilling photographs of them at the moors, as at least a few of those shots are directly over the graves of their victims. There was some controversy regarding Smith's involvement with the tabloid News of the World, given the paper was involved in a phone hacking scandal in 2006 revolving around the murder of poor Millie Dowler at the hands of Levi Belfield. It's aggravating to know this paper was scum even several decades prior. But Smith and his wife were reviled in Manchester for perceived profiting from the murders. Smith even stabbed a man in a fight regarding continued harassment and got 3 years in prison, and further drama and controversy surrounded him for years. Brady lived all the way up to May 2017. He was a diagnosed psychopath and possibly a paranoid schizophrenic, but I can't find much information on that. The same goes for an alleged personality disorder. I'd love to know more, but I'm coming up blank, and the papers in this country are garbage. Hindley wound up in Holloway women's prison. She had a relationship with one of the female guards, Patricia Kearns, which was apparently not uncommon. But that same guard was sentenced to 6 years in prison for her part in an escape attempt plot. I hope she didn't serve her time in Holloway. On 15th of November 2002, Hindley, aged 60, died. Patricia Kearns scattered the ashes. I remember reading in the papers how other prisoners would give Hindley cigarettes freely, hoping to kill her from cancer, so much was she hated. And she still haunts this island in a way Ian Brady never did. Her constant appeals to be released kept her in the papers, along with that photo, which, as far as I'm concerned, is more famous than that shot of Che Guevara.
Please be on attention.
Steve Wright, aka the Suffolk Strangler. Another English killer, Steve Wright murdered 5 prostitutes in 2006 over a period of a few weeks, and the bodies were all found over 10 days. This borders on a spree kill, so I was unsure of his inclusion in the project. He's also one of the more modern killers I've examined. Of the 5 dead, none were sexually assaulted, and 2 were strangled. The pedias are quite bare on this one, but a documentary gave me some interesting details. The first was that some of the corpses were presented aesthetically by Wright. Colin Island also staged bodies. Wright himself had joined the Merchant Navy, experienced a few failed relationships, drank heavily, had a variety of jobs, and had a problem with gambling. He solicited a lot of prostitutes ever since the early days. Killers often target prostitutes because they generate less police interest, the less dead, and or the killer has a hatred of women and or sex workers. I've made my notes on the following 90 serial killers and a few details stick out. Many killers had connections to the military and or the police and or nursing occupations. Wright's parents were a military police officer and a nurse. I find that quite interesting, but I don't really know what to make of it. He was 48 years old when he killed his first victim, and this is quite rare for a serial killer. Most start killing at a younger age, before 30, so it's likely there are other victims yet to be connected. But who knows? Colin Island was around 40 when he committed his first murder, but then again he had a much stronger criminal history. Wayne Couzens was also 48 when he raped and killed Sarah Everard in 2021, but that was his only known kill. As of 2022, Wright has been linked to some degree with several unsolved murders of prostitutes. This is still unproved, and maybe I should drop him from the list, or at least give Andrew Cunanan a spot. I'm going to run into legal trouble many times throughout this project. Wright is still alive and still being questioned, but looking at how other serial killers tend to take their crimes to the grave, I hold little hope Wright will give us any closure. Rodney Alcala, aka the dating game killer. Although only convicted of 5 kills, some say he's responsible for 8 or many, many more. I don't know much about Alcala's early life. Born in Texas, moved to Mexico aged 8, father abandoned him at age 11, and then moved to LA, California. Alcala is another serial killer who enlisted with the army, and is another serial killer with a relatively safe job within the army. In 1964, aged 20, he underwent psychological evaluation, and the results were fascinating. Alcala was diagnosed with all 3 major cluster B personality disorders: borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and narcissistic personality disorder. Histrionic wasn't diagnosed, and as far as I know, that isn't represented in serial killers nearly as much as the other 3. But other sources indicate Alcala was only diagnosed with ASPD, but I'm prepared to assume NPD given Alcala's actions. Narcissistic is the one I want to focus on, and in particular in connection to the most famous serial killer narcissist, Ted Bundy. I'll come back to this. Alcala's first known crime was abducting, beating and raping 8-year-old Tali Shapiro in 1968. He evaded authorities and used an alias John Berger, but was eventually caught and sentenced to 3 years in prison. He was paroled, assaulted another girl, sentenced again, and paroled again. He later killed 23-year-old Ellen Jane Hoover, and it was very likely not his first murder. Over the next few years, Alcala amassed hundreds of explicit photographs of children, most of whom have not been identified, and some may have been further murder victims from cold cases. After a short time as a camp counselor, he was recognized and eventually charged with the rape of one of the girls he photographed. In 1978, he appeared on The Dating Game, a popular American dating game show, and he won. This is how he got his nickname, and it remains one of the most bizarre pieces of serial killer trivia I can think of, but it makes perfect sense. As a narcissist, I can envision him being attracted to this kind of attention, and I'm sure if Ted Bundy got the chance to do this, he would have taken it. Alcala isn't the only killer to appear on TV. John Cooper was twice double murderer and twice rapist, along with a slew of other charges, and he appeared on British classic show Bullseye as a contestant. Supposedly Stephen Port appeared on an episode of MasterChef. But there's also the element of dramatic irony with Rodney Alcala. Dramatic irony is when the audience are aware of something that the characters in the narrative are not aware of. In this instance, ironically, what the audience is unaware of is Alcala was one of America's most wanted, and was a serial killer and rapist. I can't begin to imagine the narcissistic high Alcala got from this. After Alcala won, the Bachelorette actually rejected him backstage on the grounds of him being creepy. This is a perfectly natural response to a narcissist, and I think this is far more typical than trusting them. The psychopath might be undetectable, but the narcissist is easy to spot and avoid. It really makes me wonder just how normal Ted Bundy really appeared to others. But Alcala would kill at least 3 more women after this narcissistic injury, and Robin Samso, a 12-year-old girl, was also murdered around this time. The bodies Alcala left behind were staged to look a certain way. Alcala was eventually arrested and convicted for some of these crimes. With advances in DNA sampling, he was connected to several other murders over the next few decades. In 2003, Alcala defended himself and proceeded to make a mockery of the courtroom, something similar to what Ted Bundy did. During this trial, Tali Shapiro, Alcala's first victim, reappeared and testified against him. And over the next few years, more and more cases would be linked to him, but it proved tricky getting anything to stick. The part that is clear is he strangled some of his victims until they lost consciousness, then revived them to repeat this grisly process. It's been reported that his IQ is 160, but I can't find credible verification for that. If true, he's easily one of the most intelligent serial killers on the list, beating out Bittaker and even Hindley. He certainly should be later on the list, but the true scope of his crimes will never be known, as he died in 2021 on death row, aged 77.
We're gonna have a great time together, Cheryl.
Carl Panzram. Panzram is one of the earliest murderers in the 100 Serial Killers project. Given he was born in 1891 and was active from 1915 to 1929, he was just on the cusp of my cutoff date, and even now I am unsure to his inclusion in this project. With early killers, I feel the myth permeates the reality. Their story has been retold many times, with the adjectives regarding the perpetrator and their crimes presumably getting more extreme with each passing generation. What's said about Panzram makes me skeptical of its validity. Sensationalism sells newspapers, so how can I have any real confidence in what I read? A good comparison is Albert Fish. Given he was born in 1870 and his activity was around 1924 to 1932, he might also have beat the cutoff date were it not the fact that Fish only had 3 confirmed kills, despite his other crimes being so numerous and frightening. Regarding Fish's story, Albert gives me the impression of being one of the most depraved and soulless creatures to have ever existed. Carl Panzram has a suspicious, similar, larger-than-life vibe. You'd think Panzram was a walking brute of rage and ferocity, more rabid grizzly bear than man, more horror story than true crime. But then I wonder, what if this historical hearsay and conjecture were all true? How many serial killers do we really know about from this time period? And is it not conceivable that only the very worst and the most frightening have embedded themselves in the morbid subconscious of the true crime world? As always, I don't know. But I will say, if the Panzram myth even partially matches the reality, he was a beast of a man. 5 of his murders have been confirmed, but any number from 21 to over 100 have been speculated, and a terrifying list of sexual assaults and burglaries and Lord only knows what else are in his history. From a young age he was something of a beast, with petty crimes, truancy, theft, and after being arrested for drunken behaviour as young as 11 years old. After being sent to a reform school, Carl claimed he was beaten, abused and raped repeatedly by the staff. It's believed he burned down this school after a few years, so much was his hated. Alcoholism characterised his adolescence alongside burglary and theft. He then ran away, continuing a life of trouble, and after a short stint in the army and resulting imprisonment, his life of crime escalated. Assaults, rapes and robberies, often under assumed names. There was another escape from prison, where his accomplice killed the warden, and the list of lockups, frenzied escapes, violent brawls, and fake names just goes on and on. Panzram bought a yacht after burglarizing the residence of former President William Taft, who Panzram had a grudge against, and travelled for a while killing, raping, stealing. I don't know how much of it is true or myth. A burned down oil rig, attempting to poison a city's water supply, trying to start a war between the US and UK. Eventually, it all caught up with him, and he was sentenced to 25 years to life, which I find rather lenient given all he had done. But he made this a death sentence after killing a foreman in the prison he was in. On death row, he wrote his autobiography, which helped cement his enduring reputation, and wasted no effort in showing remorse or masking his infinite contempt. So he was sent to the gallows aged 39, and his last words were some variant of, "Hurry up, you Hoosier bastard, I could kill a dozen men while you're screwing around." Few other murderers I will talk about lived or died harder than Carl Panzram. His trauma history was extensive, and his criminal career showing great versatility. Looking at serial killers, most follow Lawrence Bittaker's style of appearing completely normal most of the time. Indeed, few serial killers really stand out as obviously malevolent, but Panzram was not like this. He took it to a new level, and I do think his likely embellished autobiography played a role in this perception of him. I maintain my skepticism, but I don't know if I do this out of calculated understanding of history and true crime, or out of sheer fear and disbelief like someone like this could exist, the walking embodiment of antisocial personality disorder. Richard Kuklinski, aka the Iceman. Kuklinski may or may not be tied to real organised crime, which might affect his status as a serial killer as far as my list is concerned, and again I'm worried about the integrity of my project. Serial killers are usually lone wolves or a small group or pair of people. Kuklinski is still worth looking into, and I'm not the only one who thinks so. Kuklinski's father was a violent alcoholic, his mother was an abusive tyrant, and his brother was arrested for raping a 12-year-old girl and then throwing her from the top of a building to her death. Richard's early life involved pornography distribution, some drugs, and soon a burglary ring. This ring that was connected with some of Kuklinski's murders, of which took place in the early 80s. One of the victims had been stored in a freezer for a prolonged period of time before the body being dumped, and the discovery of ice crystals in their body gave Kuklinski his notable nickname. The motives for the killings seemed to be money, and murder methods varied from guns, strangulation, bludgeoning, and cyanide poisoning. Kuklinski allegedly tortured small animals when he was young, and was later diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and paranoid personality disorder. Paranoid personality disorder is another cluster A pathology. I find it aggravating that some killers clearly killed more and won't tell the investigators, while other serial killers embellish their stories of crime and chaos. Richard Kuklinski claims to kill Jimmy Hoffa. It's all rather silly, really.
I don't think it's gotten to the point that I'm actually gonna do anything stupid.
Miyuki Ishikawa, aka the Demon Midwife. The first, mostly solo female serial killer brings with her a concept I hadn't heard about before looking deeper into true crime: baby farming. This is where the criminal takes babies and children, for a fee, with the presumed assumption the infants will be taken care of, but instead are killed. Criminal neglect, crime of omission, I don't know what to call it, but I do know Ishikawa made at least some material gain from this practice. It was post-war Japan, and a lot of children were illegitimate and or from poverty-stricken families. One could always make the argument that the parents were the real killers, but again, details are sparse. This scarce information applies to Ishikawa herself. I don't know anything about her mental health or personality, but it was said that she had her uterus removed in a surgery and as such could not have children of her own. It isn't clear to me how much of a part resentment played in her crimes, and to think so would be irresponsible speculation on my part. Her own crimes left a minimum of 5 dead children, and almost certainly many, many more, with some estimates suggesting over 100, owing to the discovery of dozens of tiny corpses at a local temple and the residence of a mortician. Ishikawa served a surprisingly light sentence, presumably owing to the limited rights babies had, and she was released after a few years. It all makes me think of a cynical infant triage with money on the side. This case helped legalise abortion in Japan to prevent this practice from happening again. I don't have much else to say, and baby farming won't come up again for this project, but one detail worth remembering is Ishikawa's profession as a pseudo-nurse, a midwife. And so ends the first part of the 100 Serial Killers project. Many of those listed here have killed more than just 5, but next we'll be moving on to those convicted of 6 or 7 murders.